What's going on, everyone? It is a fun time in Star Wars Limited right now because we are about a week out from seeing a bunch of planetary qualifiers start and, of course, continue through the next coming months, which is going to see a really big snapshot of what the meta will actually be. But as far as Star Wars Unlimited today, I'm here to give you all kind of a snapshot of what the meta has been and some of the best performing options amongst the decks that we have been seeing. I'm sure there's going to be other pet decks or decks that are just under the ones that I'm going to talk about today, or even that you might think is a little bit better. But these are going to be a good baseline if you're still deciding on what to bring, or maybe you're still deciding on what to test against in your final few days, maybe tune the sideboard or whatever it is. And here is what we're talking about: the top 6 decks that have been in the meta for the planetary qualifiers coming up and for you to prepare. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for supporting the channel. And also, I have a TCG player link in the description down below if you want to pick up any of the cards we're about to talk about today. Mind you, none of these lists are created by me. These are just the lists that I have compiled through a mix of top spots of these archetypes that have been proliferate throughout the meta so far in set 3. It wouldn't be a meta list without starting with Sabine Green. Okay, guys, you all expected this. You all knew it was coming, and you all are going to get to see it right here and right now. This is one of the more budget-friendly lists, and not to say that it's budget-friendly necessarily. You know, as it says 191 according to the SWUDB link. It is on the less expensive side. And this is a pretty standard catch-all list. If you were unsure on which one to pick, which one's going to be the best situated in the meta, etc., Sabine Green is usually your base level pick. It's almost always just going to be this powerhouse, this threat to every deck that every single deck has to have some slots dedicated for it, or just a main deck that's usually pretty good against it. Otherwise, you will run them over. And you still run people over really quickly with Sabine Green. Now, there's a lot of different minor variations with Sabine Green, but in essence, this is the exact same deck that we've been seeing since set 2. The only new addition, realistically, has been the Admiral Yularen. Everything else is some number of 2-drops, some number of 3-drops, and then we have the K2SO, Podameron, and Wrecker kind of curve out at the top end. The 2/3 drop slots, usually you have a Rebel theme. In this case, I've seen some people playing Jyn Erso. Rebel Pathfinder is also another really important one in the meta oftentimes, because you're starting to see things like Village Protectors, and Rebel Pathfinder is insane against Village Protectors. You get to kill it, and you get to open it up for whatever further drops and have Rebel Pathfinder stay alive. Also really good against Crafty Smugglers, L3s, which are very prominent. Basically, just Saboteur has gotten a lot more valuable because there's a lot more shielded options. But it's the standard Rebel curve, and you're looking to use ECL on things like K2, Podameron, or Wrecker, and that's what makes the deck extremely scary in the mid to late game, where your opponent's starting to stabilize, and suddenly you go ECL Wrecker, hit them for 6, kill their unit, they have to deal with Wrecker, and you've got other units on the board to pressure them, and the game is basically over at that point. In the sideboard, pretty standard stuff. Also, upgrade hate, things to deal with space units, a little bit more late game potential, and some early game additions like Daring Raid. Darksaber still prominently played. I would have thought it would have gone down to like 1 or 0 of, but it turns out that Darksaber is just really good against a lot of other decks like Anakin Blue or Quinlan, or basically any deck that's not Jango or Cunning Villainy that's going to be able to tap down or exhaust all of your units. Darksaber's still really broken. And even against those decks, you could still sneak in an attack or 2, and that can swing the whole game in your favor. Rebel Aggro, still good. Who knew? Funnily enough, Jango Red, one of the most prominent decks from set 3, is actually the cheapest one on this list, with a price tag about 150 right now. Now, part of that is just you're playing a bunch of commons and uncommons in the space arena to really just outrace your opponent with your tempo advantage. You're using Tarkentown to really just take control of this early game in conjunction with things like ISB Agent to deal damage to a unit and Tarkentown it away. P38 to deal damage to a unit and Tarkentown it away. Daring Raid, deal damage to a unit and Tarkentown it away. or just have ISB Agent, your P-38s, and all manner of other units tap down other units, or exhaust other units, I should say, with Jango Fett so they can't attack and deal with some of your more prominent threats. Couple all the disruption between Jango Fett, Tarkin Town, and the random direct damage that you have with the fact that you're really focusing in on space outside of turn 1, suddenly your opponent has to deal with the ability not to attack your units because of Jango Fett's exhaust, the lack of early game because of Tarkin Town, and the fact that you're going to be space dominant all at the same time, and that makes a really powerful aggro / tempo deck. This deck is built around that triple dark raid synergy where you're able to pull those vehicles and space units from your deck and really get in some massive value. Ruthless Raider and Fett's Firestar being at the top end is just absolutely excellent. And the little 1/2 of the Heavy Persuader tank later on in the game being able to exploit out, tap something down or exhaust something down and have a 7/6 or a 6/5 rather is extremely powerful. This one is one that you really do have to be careful about, and one that you really want some experience against, because Jango Fett being able to exhaust your units at many points in the game is something that you have to kind of figure out in your matches in order for you to be successful. It's also a really low curve deck. You'll notice the only 6/7 resource plays are oftentimes the vehicles that can be cheated out with Triple Dark Raid or Exploit, and the only exception being Cad Bane, which is a little bit more of a, well, win the game card later on in the game where you can just play it, get all their units, and close out the game. Cad Bane Red is very similar to Jango Red, but also at the same time almost like a mirror, in that Jango Red is all about the tempo, taking control of the early game, similar to Cad Bane, but all in space. It's built around the triple dark raid strategy of getting those vehicles out. Cad Bane is the opposite. It focuses on, well, tempo and early game control, of course, but all in the ground, built around now there are 2 of them, giving you that early access to a 5 resource play on turn 2. Similar to Jango though, playing your early game units, Tarkin Towning things away, taking control of the early game, and making sure your opponent can never recover is the name of the game. One of the strongest things you can do in this deck is something like turn 1 Crafty Smuggler, kill your 2 resource play on turn 1, into turn 2 going with now there are 2 of them for a Bossk, giving you access to kill their second turn play potentially, and leaving behind not only your Crafty Smuggler fully ready to go, but a Bossk fully ready to go, and your opponent has nothing available to them on the board. This type of curve basically wins you the game in Cad Bane Red most of the time. You can also do crazy things like turn 2 Zuckuss into turn 3 Forlom ambushing that also gets pumped up for Zuckuss giving also Saboteur if they have any shielded units. Things like that could get absolutely absurd, but again, it's all about that cunning villainy baseline of tempoing at your opponent and playing very powerful units. If you notice here in the ground spot, we have 0 aggression cards. That's because Cunning Villainy just has it all. We have the Forlom and Zuckuss combination, which we've all seen is extremely powerful. Cad Bane as a unit for late game power. Early game Underworld cards to synergize with, and now there are 2 of them. And even something like Jabba the Hutt to search for some of our tricks, like Maclunky, Waylays, and now there are 2 of them itself, allowing you to potentially curve into things like Cad Bane, or even playing a Zuckuss for 2 resources cheaper later on in the game, which can be extremely powerful. This deck even has a little bit of reach in Ruthless Raider, and Cad Bane coming down himself as a 2/8, albeit later on in the game, while giving you access to really clearing out your opponent's board by dealing 2 damage to things while you play cards is extremely powerful. This is a really powerful deck, and again, very similar to Jango Red, but completely opposite in terms of what base level arena you're going to. All ground versus all space for the most part. Granted, Cad Bane isn't all ground, just like Jango isn't all space, but they're built around 2 completely different key cards that give you the advantages that each of them are chasing after. Next up, we kind of have the spiritual successor of New Han Blue in Anakin Blue. It is very similar in the way that you are just trying to go ahead and play a very powerful kind of this aggression, vigilance, heroism, soft control / mid-range deck, just playing really powerful stuff as you go along the curve. Now, the thing that Anakin offers you, and this is something that's really, really powerful, is the ability to trade up, especially in the early game, or make anything a very powerful threat. Take, for example, turn 1 R2D2. In any normal strategy, this is like, oh, it's a 1-4. Yeah, it'll be like a minor nuisance, but it's not that big of a deal. If you have initiative as Anakin Blue and you play an R2D2 on turn 1, suddenly anything your opponent plays, for the most part, gets killed and R2 lives. Battlefield Marine gets killed, R2 lives. Sabine Wren gets killed, R2 lives. If you're playing Death Star Stormtrooper or Greedo, granted those things would have died to R2 already, but basically any play besides the shielded units or another 4 toughness unit gets killed and R2 lives. It really throws off a ton of different options, and you also get access to the powerful when/on attack abilities of not only R2 but also C-3PO. He becomes a 3/4 on attacks. Things like Queel could become a 4/3. Even things as you go up the curve, like a 3/3 shielded suddenly becomes, or a 2/2 shielded in Village Protectors with Sentinel becomes a 4/2 on attacks, which can be really crazy. K2 becomes a 6 powered overwhelm, and the list goes on, giving you this access to basically anything becoming this powerful trading tool. And because of that, you're getting pressure on probably your own base, since you are usually the one in the slower position. You have Anakin to close out the game. He deploys. He's usually a 6/7 or a 7/7 at the minimum. Oftentimes, he'll be that 7/7, and in some cases, he'll be even 8/7 or even rarely, but sometimes a 9/7 to really just absolutely run over your opponent. Couple that with the fact that you get to play Luke Skywalker in your deck and Crate Dragons. You just have a very, very powerful mid-range, extremely hard to deal with. Han Yellow has been around for quite some time at this point, starting at the beginning of set 2, where it was proclaimed as perhaps the best deck. It's still up there in the conversation within set 3, especially with some new tools. Now, OG Han, right here, we get access to arguably the most powerful 2-card combination in Star Wars Unlimited in DJ Tech, giving you the ability to permanently remove a resource from your opponents. Now, granted, if you wanted to permanently remove a resource, it does require Han Solo as well in this deck, where you're able to defeat that resource that DJ steals, so they can never go ahead and take it back. A lot of people forget that if you do kill DJ before that end of turn, that resource will return to your opponent. So it's not always a guaranteed, but that threat of that combo can completely throw off some games. Couple that with the fact that you can get that 7 turn or a 7 resource turn on as early as turn 5, where you get down a 7 drop alongside Han, can be extremely, extremely oppressive. But it's not just about those two things, where you can play Emphas Nest or Han Solo. You also just have a ton of disruption and a ton of pressure on your opponent, using things like Bodhi to attack your opponent's hand for non-unit cards. You have things, well, like we said, DJ and Tank to attack your opponent's resources, Kira to attack your opponent's resources even further by naming things in their hand, preventing them from playing stuff. Cantina Bouncer to put some stuff back into your opponent's hand. And one of the best cards, if not the best card from set 3 in Plo Koon, coming down and completely annihilating your opponent, especially considering that you can also put this down alongside a 2 resource play when you get Han down for the 7 resource turn, to where he's almost guaranteed to have that raid 3 becoming a 6/6. Add that to the fact that you also have a lot of air pressure, or space pressure, I should say, to deal with things like Jango in Millennium Falcon, Liberator Gunship, and other ambushers. Lots of tricks. One of the best cards in Cunning in all of Star Wars Unlimited. You just have some insane, insane things to do with this deck, and it is really, really smooth. It's also one of the hardest decks to play, knowing when you should be going for Han Solo's action, when you should be flipping Han and going for that 7 resource turn. If you can out-tempo your opponent, play around what they're playing around, all these manner of things, it is a really tough deck to play. Unlike all the other ones on this list, you aren't just given a, well, reasonably straightforward strategy, because when you're able to get an extra resource, the amount of things you can do in any given turn just amplifies significantly more. If you resource this turn, are you going to be able to resource on turn 3 with Han's ability? And would I rather do that if I draw this, etc., etc., etc.? Han Yellow is one of those decks where you do want to put in a lot of reps for, unlike, let's say, a Sabine Green, which you should still put in reps for. Don't get me wrong when you're going to a Planetary Qualifier, but Sabine Green is significantly easier to pick up and do decently well compared to a Han Yellow. And lastly, to finish off this list, we've got our quintessential hard control list in Bossk Blue. This is all about taking control of the board at every single turn, trying to mitigate as much damage as possible and close out the game with things like Crate Dragons, Avengers, Snokes, and Palpatines. The deck doesn't feature a lot of units. In fact, we have 17 units in the entire deck, but we have 24 events alongside 9 different upgrades, giving you access to not only bounties, which work well with Bossk, potentially double claiming them to give you tons of cards or tons of HP, but also a ton of removal options, including new ones like Merciless Contest and Perilous Position. This deck is all about drawing more cards than your opponent, getting more value, and preventing your opponent from really doing anything the entire game. And cards like the Client, coupled with Top Target and Bossk double claiming bounties, allows you to heal for such absurd amounts that can be really difficult if you ever get something like that off. Going turn to the Client, into bountying your opponent, claiming a bounty, heal 5, into the following turn, putting a bounty on your opponent, hitting them with Bossk, killing that unit, healing 10. I've easily had games with Bossk Blue and we're healing 30, 40 HP in a single game because of how much healing you have and the ability to stick it out into the late game. And when you do get in that late game and you have 11, 12, 13, 14 resources, and you can go things like Super Laser Blast into Power the Dark Side to completely remove your opponent's board, into next turn Avenger into Fell the Dragon or Takedown. It is absolutely insane what you can do to close out the game. And the reason why it's all about villainy when it comes to hard control decks is because you have a finisher like Avenger giving you that access to continuously control the board while also putting a massive clock on your opponent, as well as things like Snoke and Palpatine to go ahead and wipe the board clean and kind of set you at parity later on in the game. This deck is extremely powerful and, well, has some really powerful matchups. So these are the top 6 decks that I oftentimes think about and try to prepare for, not only in deck building, but also gameplay when preparing for something like a Planetary Qualifier. Am I going to go ahead and be able to beat things like Poe Dameron removing upgrades or Wrecker being ACL'd out and hitting me for massive amounts? Am I going to be able to keep up with some early game tempo advantage in Jango Red and Cad Bane Red, absolutely clearing out my early game? Can Tarkin Town just win the game on its own? What about Anakin Blue? Can I deal with potentially not being in initiative or even being in initiative, but dealing with things like K2SO, being able to one-shot my leader, or in Han Yellow's case, attacking it for 6 damage with a K2? That's just really hard to deal with in some cases. What about Tech and DJ? If they get that combo down, am I completely dead? Am I going to be able to go ahead and fight through the disruption that Han Yellow has? Or what about a vastly different strategy, one that doesn't even care about early game and units or anything like that? Can I compete and actually close out the game against a hard control deck like Bossk Blue? All of these things are really important questions to ask your deck. And at the end of the day, when you're picking a deck, there's going to be matchups that are 60-40, that you're going to be losing 40% of the time and your opponent's going to be winning 60% of the time. At the same time, there's going to be matchups where you're winning 60% of the time and you're losing 40% of the time. There's not any deck in the format, with the exception of Boba if he was not banned, that really just dominates against every other deck. And that's something that you have to prepare for in terms of sideboard and in games when you're looking to build your deck. And that's where the tuning of numbers and figuring out which cards you might want to go higher on to fix and help some of your win rates to give you a better chance overall. There are some other decks that you definitely could put in the conversation. I know some people argue for Quinlan all the time. Palpatine would be another one, Rey Red, and a slew of other decks, Yoda including, that could potentially jump up here. But to be honest, if you're able to handle this variety of strategies, the hard aggro, the mid-range, the hard control, the tempo decks, you should be good to handle a lot of other strategies as well. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below, and let me know if you're going to a Planetary Qualifier yourself coming up soon. And I'll see you all for the next one.